One topic guaranteed to cause a strong reaction in the media is negative gearing, and it's been hitting the headlines again with both sides of politics weighing into the argument. The problem is that many people with only a hazy idea of what it actually is blame negative gearing for virtually everything, from locking out first home buyers from the market to causing higher property prices to ugly greedy property investors rorting the tax system and driving the national budget into deficit. Indeed, the reaction to negative gearing has been, well, negative. And there's been calls to scrap it, with Labor recently saying that if it was elected it would do so, and the Liberal government now deciding to tinker with it as well. But is negative gearing really such an issue? First of all, let's understand what negative gearing is. A property is negatively geared when the costs of owning it, the interest to the loans, bank charges, maintenance, etc., exceed the income coming in. Since the costs of producing an income are generally deductible against the taxpayer's other income, property investors can effectively offset some of these losses, the interest expenses, against their income, against their wages. And this has made some argue that less fortunate taxpayers help pay for property investors to meet their costs. Now, negative gearing is nothing new. It was first introduced in 1936. But let me make things clear. Negative gearing is not, or maybe I should say differently, should not be used as a property investment strategy. It's just a result of the way your property's been financed. So it's never been a reason to invest in real estate, even though I know some misguided and maybe self-interested advisors have recommended it should be. So why would anyone enter into a business deal that makes a loss? Generally, it's because property investors hope that their income losses will be more than offset by the capital growth, the increase in the value of their property, which they can then re-access to refinance, or maybe one day access it when they sell it. Alternatively, a negatively geared property can become neutrally or positively geared as the rent increases, but in the main, negative gearing really only makes sense from an investor's viewpoint if you're hoping the property value increases. Well, not if you're hoping, it has to, doesn't it? And in Australia, capital gains is not taxed unless you sell your property, and then it's concessionally taxed. Of course, that makes some people say it favours wealthy landlords. And of course, negative gearing is favouring people on higher income brackets. If you're an investor that has excess interest of $10,000, if you're taxed at 15 cents in the dollar, it reduces your tax by $1,500. But if you're taxed at 30 cents in the dollar, you'd reduce your income tax by $3,000. So the benefit of negative gearing is greater the more you earn, or the higher your tax rate. Of course, this gets some people hopping up and down saying that negative gearing regulations are different to most parts of the world, where you can't write off your borrowings against your shares or your property against other sources of income like your wages. Also, in contrast to other countries, in Australia there's no limitation on how much a taxpayer's income is. In other words, billionaires can negatively gear as well as ordinary people, or there's no limitation on the size of your losses or how long you can carry forward those losses. But negative gearing isn't just for the rich. According to the latest Tax Department statistics, there's about 2 million property investors in Australia, of which about two-thirds, 1.3 million, negatively gear. And they don't predominantly come from the wealthy end of town. Indeed, 70% of people who negatively gear earn less than $80,000 a year. Fact is, the benefit of negative gearing has allowed many ordinary working class Australians to invest in property and start to take control of their financial destiny. You see, I think property investors provide an essential service. I'd argue that property investors provide that service to millions of Australians who choose to or have to rent their accommodation, and as such, investors should be treated like all other business people. In our modern society, we pay taxes and we expect the government to provide us with certain essential services. These include hospitals, roads, schools, jails, public transport, aged care, and public housing. In Australia, the government often shares the burden of providing these services with private enterprises because they can often deliver them more efficiently and cheaper. When the government can't supply enough public hospital beds, privately run hospitals step up to the mark and not only receive tax deductions for their business loans, but are also allowed to subsidise them. So due to aged care providers, schools, public transport providers who provide services in tandem with the government. Our Our government also provides public housing, but not enough for all those who can't afford to buy their own property. While government social and public housing programs are helpful, it's really only the private rental market that can deliver rental accommodation at the rate and scale that's required at present. Property investors save a deposit, buy a property, commit to a loan for 20 or 30 years, and provide accommodation for others in our community. In return, we expect to get a reasonable return for our investment, just like other businesses do. We know that the rent won't cover our expenses, but accept that certain tax benefits plus the long-term capital growth will make up for this. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Now, what would happen if the government removed negative gearing? Well, leverage and negative gearing compounds returns in good times, but it multiplies losses when property prices are flat or falling. I know as many people who've lost money in property investment as those who've made it. Much like most other small business people. And if the government takes away my tax concessions, I'd have to consider my investment options. To ensure I get a decent return, I'd put up my rents if I could, or maybe I'd invest elsewhere to get the best bang for my bucks. The results would be that rents would have to rise and tenants would have to fight over a fewer number of rental properties available, or the government would have to invest their own money and build properties and enjoy the pleasure of being a landlord. Of course, the government already provides some public housing, but not enough, leaving the task of providing rental accommodation in our capital cities, and also in our regional areas, and in the most remote mining towns to private investors. People like you and me have chosen to run our own little property investment businesses. If I set up a dog wash business or a restaurant, I'd be able to claim a tax deduction for legitimate business expenses, including loans to set up my business or purchasing business equipment. Why should it be any different for property investors who take on a business risk? But to say that negative gearing has pushed up property prices is a smokescreen. Just look what happened to property prices overseas in countries like the United States or part of Europe where negative gearing isn't allowed. They've experienced a boom and actually a subsequent bust afterwards of much greater magnitude than we've gone through. What these lobbyists don't recognise is that borrowing money in order to undertake productive investment actually helps economic growth because value is being added. After all, there's always going to be some investments that have lower returns than interest expenses on the loans taken out to acquire them. This economic reality has nothing whatsoever to do with tax. For example, a typical property investment may start off with a large loan and a lowish rent. As time goes on, the loan starts getting paid down and the rent increases. Overall, the investor makes a profit and the tax office gets its share. Actually, there's not as much of a loss of revenue to authorities as some critics believe, because every dollar of interest claimed as a tax deduction by a borrower has a corresponding dollar of interest income accessible to the lender. That's not all. If the government stops the availability of negative gearing benefits, the danger arises that there may be unintended consequences. It's possible that even following a positive cash flow strategy, you could end up negatively geared and suffer. What if interest rates rise after you buy the property? What happens if rentals fall or the property becomes vacant for a period of time? Or maybe you've got to undertake a major repair of your investment property. To deny the person making a commercial loss like this, a tax deduction, would be to inflict a double whammy on them and increase their hardship. So in my mind, any reduction in negative gearing benefits would significantly reduce rental investment in both new and existing properties and would worsen rental affordability through a reduced supply of investment housing. A reduced rental supply means lower rental vacancies and increased rents. Property investment is a real and effective method for bolstering the savings of middle-class Australians, at the same time providing accommodation for those who the government can't or won't help. And negative gearing should remain as is.